Greetings, tank fans. You are listening to Totally Tanked. This is episode 21, being recorded on the 21st of August, 2021. Things are really lining up here. This podcast is now legal to drink. That's pretty exciting. Not that it's ever stopped us before. My name is John, and I'm joined on the line because we're under a local COVID lockdown by Rob.
Hello, I'm Rob, and we're talking about tanks in this totally tankiest podcast ever. And what tank are we talking about today, John? The tankiest tank?
Little-known tank called Centurion.
And what do we know about the little-known tanks called Centurion?
That it is widely regarded by most tank experts as the greatest tank ever made.
There you go. And we have some, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's a very interesting tank.
We're going to talk for a long time about what those reasons are. I would note that we're going to talk a little bit at the end about some of the shakeout from Afghanistan. So if you can listen to that or not, that's up to you.
Yes.
Okay.
So Centurion, they design was started in 1942 when the Poms decided that, hang on a second, these bloody Tigers and Panthers that are coming out their guns are too big and their armor's too thick, and now cruisers and infantry tanks can't do anything to them. So what are we going to do about that? And somebody finally came up with a good idea of building a tank that could do both. It was a fast tank with big armor and a big gun.
Yeah, in some ways a response to the T-34, which should be noted was probably, I would argue, the world's first main battle tank, going back to the start of the war. But mostly the British had the 17-pounder gun. They knew it was good. They'd tried shoehorning it into Sherman. The results were mixed in Sherman because the turret was too small and the tank really wasn't built to handle a gun that big.
It still didn't have enough armor on it.
Yeah, so they said, okay, we're going to build something bigger. And around that time, they'd also made a huge innovation in the development of the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. So British tanks suddenly went from being consistently underpowered to having enough power to actually build a decent tank. And they built... Yeah.
When they started putting the Meteor in the some of the Cromwells and Comets and started doing the testing with them, they scared the bejesus out of all the local onlookers with how fast this tank was ripping around the track. But they didn't actually bother recording how fast it went, but they just said it was bloody fast.
It kind of broke the timing. I mean, my dad once told me about seeing an old Comet going around a test track that he saw, and no one believed that a tank could actually move that fast. Yeah. So we will talk about the development of Rolls-Royce Meteor because it's a really interesting story. But that was the step change, that suddenly the British actually had a power plant that would service a decent heavy tank, whereas previously their heavy tanks had been unbelievably slow.
Yeah, that's why they call them infantry tanks, because they could only keep up with the infantry.
Yeah, and they tried to pretend that, this was just a result of doctrine, but it was fundamentally because they didn't have the spare power plants. And the main reason for that was it wasn't that the British couldn't build a high-performance engine. Their racing cars and aircraft would show that they definitely could. It was simply that all of the high-performance engines they were building were going into aircraft. Most notably, the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber were both using the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. And, when you've got a Nazi army threatening to invade your country across the English Channel, and that invasion is predicated on air superiority, you can understand why it's a good idea to prioritise the aircraft rather than the tanks.
And the other big innovation for the design of the Centurion was saying, all our previous designs have been limited by the size of the railway cars they can put them on, and we just say, you know what? Let's just build bigger railway cars, and that way we can fit bigger tanks on them. And that was a huge limitation. That was the thing that was stopping any tanks getting wider at that time. Saying,
you did solve the problem that railway tunnels were the limiting factor on the rolling stock. But the other thing was that as engines had gotten more advanced, you could have tank transporters that weren't railway cars, and you could transport them on trucks. Yeah. And in 1939, those trucks didn't exist, but by 1943, they did.
Yeah. So, but that was a definite consideration of how the British were designing their tanks and saying it had to be only this wide. It can only be, and so it made them longer, which made them less efficient, and they couldn't power them as well. So that was a big step forward by saying, yep, let's just build bigger vehicles to haul them around on.
Now, I just want to share a little story of mine surrounding Centurion, which was that when I was, I think, 15 years old and thinking about what sort of first car I wanted to buy, which is funny because I didn't actually get my license until I was 25, the Australian Army started selling off the Army Reserve stock of Centurion tanks, and they were selling them for $25,000 each, and this was sometimes in the mid-'80s. And I got very excited by this because at that time, second-hand cars in Australia were obscenely expensive, and like my friends were thinking about buying Nissan Pulsars for $18,000, and I thought,
a good old Ford Escort.
Yeah, I thought I could spend that money on a tank. I could get a Centurion for $25,000. But then my parents explained that they weren't going to let me park the Centurion in their yard. And also they weren't going to be $25,000 to buy a tank with. So that dream came to an end. But it is the only tank that I've ever seriously given any thought to owning, or actually had a real possibility of owning. So I felt a long-term affection for it from that. And also a couple of years ago when I was working at the Australian War Memorial, they had a Centurion parked outside the admin building. So I got to marvel at it every day as I walked into the office.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a tank that I first would have been climbing around on. When back in the day when you were allowed to climb on the tanks outside the Australian War Memorial, there was the Centurion there that lots of kids loved climbing over it. It was great fun, and it was a great piece of kit to muck around on.
It was a source of an enormous number of broken arms.
Yep, that's what happens.
Excellent. Okay.
Now the thing, so the Centurion was designed to be a counter to the Tiger. It was supposed to be able to handle an 88 round to the front of it, and its gun had to be good enough to take out a Tiger. So that's why they'd mounted the 17-pounder in there initially. Another big innovation for it was saying, you know what makes a tank really upgradable is a wider turret ring. And so where previously they'd had a standard American-sized turret ring of 69 inches, they've decided to, no, we're just going to go bigger. That way we can make more room for the 17-pounder to get in there. And they've done that, and it's been very effective. And in fact, it's been so effective throughout the life of the tank by having that larger turret ring. That's why it's been so upgradable over the years and still in operation even now in South Africa. So, and lots of other hugely different, but it's all predicated around that part of the tank. It's why. So that's 74-inch turret ring. That 5 inches, ladies, makes a big difference. So yeah, and look, that was part of it. And so but the thing was, it didn't make it to the World War II. Sorry, it arrived in April and March, April 1945. It got driven around a bit, was doing some testing. The first 6 variants got over there and in Belgium, and then making their way up to, I want to say Denmark, but didn't actually see any combat action. So
yeah, I'm not sure they got outside of France, from what I've heard. Certainly, it's a bit shady. They were definitely deployed to Europe. There were 6 of them, but they definitely didn't see combat, and where they exactly got to in between.
Sorry, getting up to Denmark, I think it was after VE Day. Sorry, that was later on. But yes, they made a lot of movements around, and it was all being driven around by themselves. So it was quite a good testing for them of the capabilities of being able to drive throughout Europe on the roads there without breaking down. So that was a good test of that capability as well.
Yeah. Now let's quickly note what's the operational range of a standard model Centurion, Rob?
About 100 Ks.
Less than that.
Yeah, not very far. It has it's got a petrol engine. So our V12 Merlin Rolls-Royce...
Meteor, my friend.
Rolls-Royce Meteor V12 engine, 27 litre, has got two very small fuel tanks, which take it, which you can do up to about 32 Ks an hour on road. And yeah, had a range of, with those 2 fuel tanks, less than 100 Ks. So yeah, you need, and at that stage, the only way to refuel the tank was from jerry cans. So that wouldn't have been a fun thing. But what sort of innovation did they come up with, John, to overcome this limitation?
They came up with a stupid trailer.
The monowheel. The monowheel. Say it with me. The monowheel.
Monowheel.
So they had this trailer that they hooked onto the back of it. It had its own wheel, a single wheel, and it was an external fuel tank that would increase the range. Nobody liked it. It was a very stupid design, and it was just one of those things that say, right, we've got this problem. We're going to come up with a bad solution. We're going to apply it. What they eventually ended up doing, at least for the Australian ones, I'm assuming everybody else did, is just bolting on a 100-gallon fuel tank on the back of the tank, putting some armor around it and saying, right, there you go. There's another however many extra Ks you can get out of it. So when they came to Australia, that's at least happened. I'm assuming that everybody else did it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Israelis re-engined to diesels as well, which solved all those problems.
Yeah, most countries that kept them going for longer did put a diesel engine in them. But for the actual use of the tanks when they were deployed out from to Australia and the other Commonwealth nations and lots of other countries, they kept them with the petrol engines until they were mostly retired in the 70s and replaced by Leopard 1s.
In Australia, definitely, yeah. And, again, kept in the Australian Army's reserve until the 80s. So in the event of, World War III, they probably would have been dragged into some use. Okay, look, shall we address now the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine?
I think so.
So, Rolls-Royce Meteor engine was invented by a fellow called W.A. Robot Ham, which is very exciting.
I'm not sure that's actually how you pronounce it.
It might be Robotham, yeah. Robotham, yeah. William Arthur Robotham, who basically noticed that the Merlin engines going into the planes, there were an enormous number of spare parts left over that weren't up to aviation use because it's very exacting standards. Because if the engine fails in the sky, it's a problem, but if the engine fails on the ground, it's less of a problem.
And and planes have to have their engine at full tilt all the time, whereas a tank is allowed to idle its engine most of the time.
Yeah, and also they depowered these engines by about 50% for tank use as well, on the basis that they'd have to do protracted running, whereas an aircraft engine only runs at 100% for a few hours. Certainly aircraft of World War II vintage, they weren't doing what current jet engines do in terms of flying around the world. So what was the brilliant solution he had was to take all the spare parts coming out of the reject bin of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and rebuild them into the Meteor, which was for going into tanks. And this meant just suddenly overnight, the British went from not having enough high-power engines to having high-power engines to go into everything. Admittedly very thirsty engines, but thanks to the Persian Gulf, the British were never short on fuel in World War II. So quite brilliant of this fellow to do this. And what I hadn't realised until I started researching this, they were also getting spare parts from Merlin engines to go into Meteor by literally pulling crashed engines out of the ground all around the UK from all the planes that had been shot down in the Battle of Britain. And they were putting those parts into the Meteor as well, which is that's really quite clever. I've never heard of anyone reusing those engines for anything.
Yeah, but when we say how good this was, it doesn't mean this man had a mountain of administrative battles to overcome. The number of times he quit the ministry and saying, you guys are a bunch of idiots and you have no idea how to do anything was quite high. And every time they would have to drag him back in and put him back to work, or he'd go off and work in his own workshop to get these things going. It was just remarkable that he was able to achieve so much with so much bureaucratic headwind, stopping his ability to develop and roll these things out. Actually have, and saying to the Army tank design teams, what do you actually want? Nobody knows what they actually want. And finally said, look, you know what? I'm just going to make something good and you can use it from there.
Yeah, now there's a couple of really choice quotes from this fella that I like. One was that the design and development of British tanks had been shamefully neglected, with ill-informed criticism of the politicians, the kaleidoscopic changes in policy by the General Staff, and the relentless pressure for output regardless of quality. And he then went on to tell Lord Beaverbrook that they had enough unreliable tanks to last the war. Particularly Covenanter was sort of in that period, and one day we'll probably have to cover Covenanter, but the thing to note with it was so terrible, and they made 1,000 of them. It was never deployed, but it was used as a training tank on the basis that if the crews could survive using this appalling tank, life would be easier for them when they graduated to something else. So, hey, there might be future for Ajax on that basis.
Only if they could do the training in under 47 minutes.
Anyway, so quite the character, Robotham. Obviously, quite a keen intellect and very
an engineer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, the other big thing about adopting this engine was because it had been rolled out in a number of other tanks. So when the Centurion was got it, and they were rolling it out in the Centurion, you already had a maintenance schedule for the engine, you had spare parts for it, and you had all your mechanics were already trained in maintenance and repairs on the engine. So that actually saved a great deal of training and logistics time for this for the tank, so that when it rolled out, everybody liked it because they knew how to service it and they knew how it worked. It made things a lot easier.
A bigger pool, and like manuals didn't need as much rewriting, and I mean it still was a different engine in some regards to an aircraft engine, but
the point is one of the things highlighted for how good the Centurion was is because they had those capabilities when it first came out.
Okay, so that's the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, which lets a 55-ton tank be. Now, we say it's quick. Its top speed of, 35 miles an hour is not...
No, 32 Ks.
So 32 kilometres an hour is not super fast. But one thing they did do was emphasise that road speed wasn't what they were aiming for. It was cross-country speed.
Yep.
And it was particularly powerful in the low gears, which is what would let it do what it would do through its fighting career, which was shooting and scooting really effectively. So it could fire and then back out of a revetment and find another position.
And part of the requirement there, you're talking about backing out of the revetment, was after the issues they'd had, the British tanks had in Italy, whereby they'd be in a sunken road and they'd get attacked from the sides and had to reverse out. They found out that reversing is a very particular skill in a tank and it needs to be done fast. And the British tanks at that stage did not have a fast reverse gear. And so they said, you know what, we need a tank that can reverse fast. And that's part of the requirements they built into the Centurion so that it can do that. And that's why it's got 2 reverse gears and you can actually go a good 7 Ks an hour in reverse. Was it 7 miles? I can't remember, but which is over more than twice as fast as any other tank that they had at that stage.
But it's interesting that we often think in terms of speediness about top speed, whereas what this thing was built to do was accelerate to a relatively low speed, but do that very quickly, which let it get a tactical jump on its opponents.
And it did have some stabilization within the guns, so that it could actually fire on the move. You wouldn't want. They didn't do it fast, but you could at least keep on moving and fire with some degree of accuracy, which is most tanks at that stage did not have. So that was a big step for it. And talking about the guns, we started off with the 17. So the prototypes had a 17-pounder and a 20 cannon inside. Coaxial cannon, yeah. But everybody said the coax cannon was a silly idea, so they got rid of that and just put in a coax machine gun. And then they upgraded.
I think for this, the time when they were first designing it in 1943, it would have had some merit on, say, a 1944 battlefield where, mostly you're encountering soft-skin vehicles and 7.62 is underkill and 20mm is quite nice for blowing up a truck. But by the time it was actually being deployed, you needed the big gun for most about everything you were going to do.
Yeah, and so from there they put in a 7.62, and then later on we've put in the 20-pounder, so that becomes so we've gone from a 76mm gun to an 84mm with the 20-pounder. That's been rolled out as standard for quite a long time. and then eventually they went up to the L once they developed after the Hungarian, which was Hungary or was
I think it was Hungarian that where they captured
we
the
gifted.
T-55.
Yeah, they gifted the T-55 to study, and they said, "Oh, that's where we need," and that's where they've developed the L7 105 mil gun, and they've said, "Right, we're going to install that." And again, this all gets back to having the wider turret ring. They were able to make all these changes and install bigger guns within it. So eventually the Centurion ended up with the L7 105, a 50 cal spotting gun on it, and a 30 cal coax, and sometimes they would mount another 30 cal pintle mount on the commander's turret.
Yeah, which as we've discussed, is almost always a bad idea, but sometimes it seems like a good one. Now other things to note, of course, is that it had a proper crew, which is to say there were 4 of them. Yeah. And so that's commander, gunner, loader, and driver. The suspension was horseman, so it was a series of double bogies that were sprung against each other, and with the quite big road wheels, which was something that copied from the German big cats, although these ones weren't interleaved. It gave a very stable and commanding off-road performance.
And it was all externally mounted, so if you had any damage, you could actually get to the road wheels and the suspension from the outside, and so that made it more easy to access for maintenance and repairs. Yeah, more susceptible to enemy fire, which is why they then introduced side skirts for the tank, which were useful in a lot of environments, but not all.
Yeah, so the side skirts, it's a classic one. If the Centurion's deployed to the jungle, the side skirts come off, and if the Centurion's deployed to the desert, the side skirts definitely stay on because they keep out shaped charges quite well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can make it look like a very different tank. For people playing Tank ID at home, it can be quite a tricky one. It's really the turret shape I go by to ID my Centurions. Even then, the different marks with the different cannons can look quite different. So. Okay. All right. Okay. What do you want to talk about now, Rob?
Well, let's talk about the rolling them out into to the foreign market and the development and what the bombers were doing. Initially, the Brits were saying, all right, we've got this really cool tank. Everybody likes it. We're the pride and joy of the Empire, but we're not going to sell it to anybody until all our own tank brigades have been filled with these glorious new tanks. And that went really well until the British government ran out of money and said, oh, these things cost a bit to make. What we might do is might sell a few to our neighbours and friends and family, so that we can afford to buy all the other ones, build all the other ones we want to build. So that's what they've done. So they had stated that they weren't going to put them out until they'd filled all their own, but they couldn't afford that. So they started selling them off. And Australia was supposed to be the first batch of deliveries for the Centurion in 1950. Unfortunately, on the boats over to Australia, they got diverted away and sent to Korea for the Korean War, where the British incorporated them into their existing armoured brigades. And so they carried out a decent and sizable contribution to the Korean War for the Commonwealth forces over there.
Which was not the last time that a war would see our gear getting nicked by the POMs. Because in 1982, a whole aircraft carrier was on its way to Australia and it got taken away from us when the Falklands War broke out. Yes, moving on.
Yeah. Okay, Australia eventually got their tanks in 1952, but at the same time, the bombers were also selected to quite a number of other countries, mainly actually the US, and this is actually quite while they ended up in Denmark, in Austria, and the Netherlands, they're actually all purchased by the US and given to those countries in order to help defend against communist forces rolling through the Fulda Gap. So while they might have been deployed and used by those countries, it was actually the US paying for them initially, and then they had to go from there and then use them from there and maintain that.
It's worth noting that obviously at this point we weren't letting the Germans build their own tanks for regrettable reasons. So Centurion sort of filled the role at the time that Leopard and Leopard 2 would fill later as the Euro tank.
Yeah, and it's actually, it is quite interesting that all these countries, when they did retire, including Sweden, when they retired the Centurion, the first thing that they did it because the Leopard 1 was suddenly available and said, right, we're going to that, thanks very much. It's newer, it has more technology, it's more capable, has better firing on the move. But then again, it was a tank that was built 35 years later, so it's not surprising, really.
Centurion was certainly the early marks, because it's worth noting it developed quite a lot over even the official Centurion marks before we get into the shots and Oliphants. It was a pretty basic tank in a lot of ways. It borrowed a lot, in my view, from the way the T-34 said what needs to be really good and what is okay to be just adequate, and it had a lot of stuff that was merely adequate as well as some things that were really good.
Yeah, and what do you need on the inside and what can you just whack on the outside and not worry about? So they had a lot of external bins that they just said, you know what, we're just going to put everything on the outside, and if it gets blown up, it gets blown up. That's going to be life.
And things like the tracks were so primitively attached that it's so possible to get them stuck if they get misaligned on the wheels, that they actually came with blasting charges for blowing the tracks off the tank if they got stuck.
That was in the recovery vehicles would have those, not the tanks themselves.
I believe it was the early models. It was standard for all of them because the tracks got stuck so often.
Right.
Mm.
But yeah, so a number of other countries purchased them. So Sweden has bought it and then called it the Stridsvagn, of course. Somehow the Free Libyan Army has still got some, or supposedly has some. In Austria, they converted theirs into blockhouses and just cemented the turrets into the ground. Canada used them for a number of years, again, converting to the Leopards afterwards. Egypt, and this was a funny one because Egypt bought a number from the POMs, and then in the Six-Day War of 1967, there was Egyptian Centurions taking on Israeli Centurions, so that's always a fun one. India purchased a number of them, and then Singapore got a number of them from India and Israel. Israel got some. Iraq supposedly got some, but I can't find any numbers on that. So that was, again, straight after in the 50s when the POMs were trying to prop up Iraq and keep the oil flowing before Iraq started leaning towards the Eastern Bloc and Russian tanks. Kuwait bought a number of them, and they gave 35 of them away to Somalia, the Somali army in 1977, so who knows where they are. Lebanon bought a few. Again, they've probably lost all theirs to the Israelis. And New Zealand bought quite a number, bought 12 and sold most of those to Australia in the early 80s as training tanks. So, yeah. Which
is probably good, seeing as they probably stole all the spare parts for them from us in the first place.
And of course, South Africa and India are probably the other, and Israel are the three main users of. Oh, sorry, and I shouldn't forget Jordan. Jordan's also
the good old British Legion. Sorry, the Arab Legion, not British at all. Yep. Oh no, pass the tea. Shall we start talking about Centurion's battlefield experience, Rob? Because we could be a while on this.
Yeah, we could. I think we've covered all the bits and pieces of the funny little things about the tank itself. Don't worry, fans, it does have a tank phone. Now, the Australians had to move, when they put the extended fuel tank on the rear, they had to move the tank phone from the rear to the side of the extended fuel tank. But it still had one. So that's always like to make sure that everybody knows. I don't think there's anything else actually about the build. Oh, there was 23 tanks built in all sorts of different configurations, and has been over time they have been converted into various different things like APCs, recovery vehicles, or things. It's basically as a hull, it's a very good hull. It does the job well, so it's been converted into all sorts of things.
Yeah, so I just want to note that's 4,423 Rob was referencing there. Yeah.
Yes.
Just bears repeating because it's a big number.
It is for a Western tank. It is a big number, and it was these. Before we go into its actual conflict history, we should say that it was a mainstay of Western Europe's defence against, like the M60, Western Europe's defence against a communist attack from the Eastern Bloc. And so
the Warsaw Pact.
The Warsaw Pact. Basically, it spent most of its time in Germany preparing for those activities. So whether it was the, as I said, the Dutch, the Denmark, or the Germans, West Germans, Canadians, the POMs, they all were manning their Centurions in West Germany, waiting for things to kick off for a great many years. So it was deployed and in waiting for things to start. And luckily enough for everybody, nothing happened there. And I'm really grateful for that. But it did see quite a number of, and it was built from 1942 to 1962. There was no further ones built after 62, but they have been going since then. So that's a decent chunk of time to be still going from those hulls still to be going now. So I think the first point we need to address is the fact that Australia dropped an atomic bomb on one of theirs.
The atomic tank. Yeah.
The atomic tank.
And then we took it to war.
And so all the tank fans will know about this, but for anybody who listens and hasn't heard about it,
I think Rob, we should possibly concede the possibility that non-Australian tank fans might never have heard of the atomic tank.
Well, I can't believe that. Anyway, so 1953, the British were doing their atomic testing in Australia.
Oh, come on. We asked them to do it. Okay, come on.
And the Australian Army carried out those tests for the British. And part of it, they'd just been delivered these brand new, fresh off the boat, literally fresh off the boat, Centurion tanks, and they've driven one over they've railed one over as far as they could towards Woomera, which is where the atomic explosion was going to be undertaken. And there's no road out there. It was in the middle of nowhere. They'd built an airstrip and they flew everything in and everything out because they wanted to maintain security and secrecy. So
we should note there was a significant Indigenous population on that land that no one thought of as people, which is an ongoing source of grievance.
Very sore point of Australian history, and a very, very not very nice one. But the thing is, they could only rail the tank to a certain point, and then they had to whack it on the back of a low loader, which was only just able to get it a little bit further, and then the tank had to drive itself the rest of the way to the atomic.
Being refueled with jerry cans every 50 miles.
As it went cross-country through the desert.
But eventually... Yeah, something like Tank Girl, yeah.
But eventually they got it out there, and then they've parked it 320 metres from the ground zero. They've locked it all down, turned the engine on, and said, right, see how she goes. Then they've gone back, set off the bomb. It was only a 10 kiloton explosion, but...
A mere 10,000 tons of TNT equivalent,
Yeah, for 300 meters away. And they said, right, this will be blown to hell. But they've gone out there, and the tank is there. It's been moved back 5 feet. All the external bits have been blown off of it. The engine has stopped, but that's only because, guess what? It ran out of petrol.
Yeah. Also worth noting, all of the sight pieces, so like the periscope glass, the radiation had clouded those completely. But that's a 5-minute job to replace. So yeah.
And after 3 days, they've gone out to it. They filled it up with more petrol. They've turned it over and they've driven it off, and then they've refurbished it again. So it was they hosed it down from the radiation with a fire hose, and so hopefully that did the job.
Just washed all the radioactive fallout somewhere else
onto the desert. All right. Anyway, but the thing
is, it was a different time.
It survived. It survived a nuclear blast, and then they filled it up with petrol and they drove off. Yes, they said all the crew would have died because of the shockwave from the thing, but the tank survived. So,
was quite easily reserviceable and did go on to fight in Vietnam, I believe.
Yeah, it was deployed to Vietnam in 1968 and carried out activities there. So yes, and now stands as as one of the gate guards for the Australian First Armoured Brigade at Robertson Barracks in Darwin.
There we go.
Yeah, so
you can go see it when you're allowed to travel to Australia at some point in the distant future.
yes, go see the atomic tank as it's called. Anyway, so that's the first thing I thought we'd better share about. What we do.
Now, if we're going to talk about operational deployment, do we want to talk Vietnam first or the Indo-Pakistani wars?
Well, first off, Korea.
We did Korea, but okay, yeah, go on.
No, it's fine. No, there's nothing. Well, they performed well in Korea, and they took out a number of captured Cromwells. Actually, this is the first tank kill of the Centurion in battle was a captured Cromwell. So that was interesting. But yes, they served well for the Brits and the Commonwealth forces in Korea and did well there. And then I think we go on to the India-Pakistan war.
Okay. I just note on Korea, the Americans were very surprised at the ability of Centurions to climb up onto the top of mountains, and then because they had quite a high turret to press their gun and fire into valleys. I think, what's the quote here? General John O'Daniel of the US First Corps said that in their Centurions, the 8th Hussars have evolved a new type of tank warfare. They taught us that anywhere a tank can go is tank country, even the tops of mountains.
Yep. That's a pretty important achievement by having good gun depression and sitting on a hold-down position on top of a tank, top of a hill that you can actually get up to. You're in a much better off position than if you're relying on the ability to drive across a open plain and take out enemy tanks at range.
Mm-hmm. All right, which one's next?
The India-Pakistan War of 1965.
Yeah, now this was big tank battles.
The biggest tank battle since Kursk or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the Iraq War is probably bigger depending on how you count it.
Yeah, but that was since, as I'm saying, since Kursk. Yeah. So, I mean, yes.
And the funny thing was they were fighting M47 and M48 Pattons of the Pakistani 1st Armoured Division.
Yes.
And the Centurion, which at the time was thought to be a bit of an old tank and not so good, and still only armed with the 20-pounder tank gun mostly. There was a mix of the 20-pounders and the 105s.
Yes.
Anyway, smashed the Pakistani armour. Now, you could say some of that was training, and probably was.
I think there was a number of factors here. One, just for people to understand, there was it wasn't just a general invasion of India by Pakistan. There had been a number of conflicts going on, and at this point in time, Pakistan was trying to conquer a small part of India that they believed is mainly Muslim population that should have been segregated as part of part of Pakistan during the separation.
Yeah, now I would just note that doesn't get talked about, I think, enough, is that Pakistan is the first 3 letters stand for the 3 provinces, Punjab, Amritsar, and the K is meant to be Kashmir. So that when people say, why does Pakistan keep fighting over Kashmir, it's because it is literally in their name as a third of the country. And the rat bastardry of the partition of India, which was largely inflicted by the British, led to a third of what everyone thought, to the point it was in their name, should be in Pakistan, somehow ending up outside of Pakistan. And this is not the sole reason for the conflict, but certainly important to understand it.
Yeah, and so while the Centurions were a major part of it, I've just been reading about the Battle of Assad Uttar, or however you would like to pronounce it.
Assad Uttar, I think. Yeah.
Yep, and how the Indians said, you know what, we can see these guys coming in. We know what their tactics are probably going to be, so they've pulled themselves back into a horseshoe formation, flooded the field the night before of where the Pakistanis were going to advance, and as the M47s and M48s have driven into this flooded field, they become so bogged down that they became a bit of a duck shoot for the Indian Centurions to see these tanks that were surrounded on three sides, unable to maneuver, and it was just not only superior tanks but it's also superior intelligence and
generalship,
leadership, and taking advantage of the terrain.
And there's nothing like armor, be it armor of the 12th century or armor of the 20th century, advancing into a flooded field. It's a timeless fail.
But it was the fact that the Indians had actually gone out the night before and said, right, let's turn on the hose and see what happens. I thought that was a particular piece of brilliance on their behalf. And because the Pakistanis were following certain doctrine whereby you advance and you advance and advance, and it's your advance that is going to overrun the enemy rather than stopping and engaging and looking to break through their lines. But yes. With the time, the saying is, time spent in reconnaissance is rarely wasted. I think the Pakistanis could have used some more reconnaissance there. So from this, the Indians were able to repel the Pakistani advance, and this stopped the invasion essentially in its tracks. And the Pakistanis basically took everything up and left. The area that happened is now called Patton Field or something like that. So because all the patterns were growing there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this sort of comes back to the Centurion Mark 7 was considered one of the most modern tanks in the world at the time. So it's slightly disingenuous to say it was an old tank in comparison, but it's sort of the Centurion is more than the sum of its parts in many ways, and this was a really good example of that.
Yeah. Then I think we move on to. Do we want to go?
I think Vietnam's time has come.
Okay, Vietnam. So Australia's, as when they've gotten involved in Vietnam, have decided that they need. While nobody thought tanks, jungle is not really tank country, the Australians have sent over a company. I want to say, I can't remember. Sorry, squadron. Yes, sorry, squadron of Centurions. To carry out activities over there, and they've been used to very effectively. The Australians, with a few modifications, the Australians found them to be highly effective vehicles in the terrain. They couldn't go over the various bridges over there because it's not rated for the weight of the tanks.
55 tons, yeah.
Yeah.
I would note it's kind of funny because I mean, firstly, the Australian Centurions when they were first sent to Vietnam were called koalas. Because they weren't to be exported and they weren't to be shot at, but then the issue was that there was a fellow Colonel Donald Dunstan who was the deputy task force commander of the Australian task force. In World War II, he had been the very last Australian to command combined tanks and infantry in the Bougainville campaign. And he said, well, stuff it. If we've got the tanks here, get them up there.
So while there was no essentially front line for the Australians because they were surrounded on all sides by jungle, yes, he has sent them up to a number of places just in time for...
shall we say.
Yeah. He sent them up just in time for great big attacks by the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong, and they've performed hugely well at the Battle of Coral and Balmoral, which was a big battle in Australian terms. We've just gone past Long Tan Day, but again, the tanks arrived a little bit late there, but they were around. So while they weren't designed for jungle warfare, but they have performed very well. And the Australians found the canister rounds were very effective at clearing jungle. Shredding the jungle and exposing any sort of hidden bunkers or areas of enemy troops.
I mean, I think they were very lucky with Dunstan as the commander in that not only was he an experienced tank commander, but he was experienced at the rarest of tank command, which is jungle tank command.
Yes.
And to have that, largely by luck, that wasn't planning, in Vietnam was...
Because remember, that was from 45 to 68, so he's been in the Australian Army for another 23 years after using them, and is still only a lieutenant colonel. So he's hanging around because he likes the job.
Yeah. I mean, and there were a bunch of engagements, mostly where, Vietnamese would fire a rocket-propelled grenade at a Centurion, and then Australian forces would spend 3 days smashing the jungle around them.
Yes.
So originally 26 were deployed, and 58 in total served in country, of which 42 had battle damage, 6 damage beyond repair. Only 2 crewmen killed in action, though, which... Considering they were always at the pointy bit and the biggest target, is a real attestation.
The Viet Cong were very disappointed with their inability to affect the tanks with their RPG-7s. Not only that, is that the Americans were surprised with the Australians' ability to carry out repairs and maintenance for battle-damaged tanks in the field, rather than having to have them either abandoned
to a shop we didn't have.
Yeah, or abandoning there and saying, well, just blow it up, and that way the enemy can't have it. But Australians said, well, no, this is all we've got, so we're going to fix them. And again, it's that ease of maintenance and ability to repair and the access to spare parts made a big difference in what they could carry out. So,
okay, where are we going next?
I think we need to go to Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur, which is probably the highlight. The highlight of the Centurion's
the best tank battle ever.
Yeah, the highlight of the Centurion's battle diary.
Okay, although these are shot cal versions, so diesel engined. But do you want to tell the Svika Force story, Rob, or shall I?
Well, it started out in 73. Again, it's not a overall main invasion of Israel in order to wipe out Israel, even though that's probably what the Arab nations were hoping at that point in time. It was after the Six-Day War in 67. The Israelis had taken quite a bit of territory in the Sinai, and Egypt and the other Arab nations were looking to recapture, or at least get into a position to force Israel to negotiate the return of that land. And that is why they've all come together. And when I say all, it's without Jordan this time. Jordan's decided they've had enough of this battle, but it's Syria, Egypt, Morocco. I think there's some Libyans in there. All came together. Egypt and Syria being the main two, Lebanon. All came together to attack Israel from the north and the south, and try and force recapture the ground, and then force Israel to take a more humiliating peace treaty like they had to in this after the Six-Day War. So on this day it was 1973. The Egyptians have attacked from the south, but coming down from the north is the Syrian armed forces with about 500 tanks, of mainly T-55s and T-62s, and they've gone driving through the Golan Heights, and the Israelis happen to have been doing a few tank maneuvers around that point in time, and had 100 Centurions up on top of the Golan Heights, and said, "Ooh, this is going to be a rough couple of days." And you can take it from there. So
Svika Force, a young Israeli lieutenant, was visiting his family, as you do in Yom Kippur, and the war started, and he rushed up to the Golan Heights to try and rejoin his unit. And when he got to the depot, there was just chaos and people running away. And he managed to convince a couple of other guys to jump in one of the tanks that was sitting in the depot, got on the comnet and said, "Hello, I'm reporting for duty." And they said, "We don't know what to do with you." So he got given a call sign of Svika Force, which Syrian signal intelligence immediately identified. Aha, Svika Force is in the field, not realizing it was just one tank. And then he proceeded over the course of 72 hours to continuously engage the invading Syrians, very effectively using the shoot and scoot as the Centurion is good at. Because the Syrians thought it was some large, maybe brigade-sized force, they were very cautious, whereas they could have easily just overwhelmed it. I think he had 3 tanks shot out from under him, but kept just jumping into another tank and finding more people to help him crew them. And I believe he's been mayor of the Golan settlement for a very long time in sort of recognition of his work. But just quite incredible that one determined guy. I think after 72 hours, the main assault had been fought off. And then he just passed out because he hadn't slept.
Well, his wasn't the only situation with that. So the first armoured brigade, so the armoured brigade that was stationed on the Golan Heights, they had about 100 tanks. And you got the Shotkal Centurion tanks. They've been facing over 500 plus Syrian T-55s and T-62 tanks. The Syrians were a little bit disorganized, but again, they had been trained by the Russians and they were quite a formidable force. But with the Israeli tanks situated on top of the Golan Heights, the Syrians have had to cross quite a wide area of open ground, intentional open ground, and then there was a large tank ditch so it was wide enough that tanks couldn't cross it, and so they had to bring their bridging tanks up to the Syrians had to bring their bridging tanks up to lay the bridges across so their tanks could follow across. But when they got there, when they got the advance was happening, they got to the tank ditch, they found that their tank bridges were at the back of the column rather than at the front, and so then had to muck around a lot, and that caused a huge amount of chaos all the time. Right in the middle of the Israelis are sitting up the top of the Golan Heights and blowing the hell out of these vehicles. And after the first day, I think it was 135 dead. But the Syrians aren't stopping. So over the next 3 days, they've gotten past the tank ditch. They've gotten up into the Golan Heights. They've surrounded the Israelis. They've gotten past them. They've had commandos being helicoptered in left, right, and centre of them. And they're losing a number of Centurions, but they're still in the field, they're still fighting. And every time they keep saying, we need to withdraw, the commander's saying, look, just hold on for another half hour and we'll see how you go. And they kept on surviving. And they turn around and say, look, we need to withdraw. We've only got 1 round in the 4 tanks in our platoon. And they're saying, so we fired all the tanks, we've blown up all the enemy, we've only got 1 round left each. And they said, well, the enemy doesn't know that. Stay there for another 10 minutes and we'll see what happens. And they did. And then eventually, after 3 days of hard battle, the Syrians left. And it was as simple as that, is that they had pushed these poor 100 tanks to the absolute limit of their capabilities of no sleep, no ammunition, no ability to fight back. But they kept on going and going and going, and they'd every once in a while they'd rotate some vehicles back, rearm, refuel, get the guys some nice hot cup of tea, some food. Because don't worry, folks, the Centurion does have a tea boiler inside of it.
It was the first. It was the original. Have we talked about the boiling vessel enough, or should we quickly go over it now?
No. Anyway, so don't worry, they had a cup of tea there, and they would be pushed back to the front and it only carries 62 rounds, and so they would push them back out to the front and keep on fighting. And again, can't emphasize enough that the fact that the Syrians were all around them, they had gotten in amongst them, behind them. There were commandos running around, trying to blow stuff up. And look, they did lose a number of tanks. And it's not like a case of they all came out unscathed. They lost lots of tanks. But the thing is, they held the pass, they held the Golan Heights, and the Syrians had to depart on the 4th day. Now, there is speculation whether or not it was just their losses that had forced their retreat, or if there had been other politics happening in the background of the Israelis saying, if you get past here, we're going to nuke the hell out of you guys. Now, So that's all speculation. There's been nothing released, but it'd be a good little threat when you think you're just about to lose, because the Israelis were just about to lose when they finally, the Syrians said, right, we've had enough, and went home.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely reasonably well established that the Israelis did have the nukes loaded onto their jets to go destroy some cities. I agree with you, it's not established whether the Arab nations were aware that retaliation was ready to go.
And whether or not they were made aware that it was going to happen if they took one step further.
Yeah, I mean, my read of the history, and admittedly all of that history is biased by people with agendas, is that the Israeli army succeeded in the field before the nuclear deterrent was needed.
I agree with that statement. They've carried out their activities to such a degree that they've shown their capabilities, and with these sort of this sort of invasion, this hard-hitting attack, you really do need to succeed in the first 4 days. Otherwise, the political will is going to disappear.
Well, you run out of ammunition, and it takes months to resupply as well.
Yeah, and it was a good indication of the difference. It was the first time we've had a real big Soviet bloc supplied and trained force versus a Western supplied and developed force. And showed the capabilities of the Centurion versus its Soviet bloc counterparts.
Which was quite important, because up until that point, if you just measure tanks on your top trumps numbers, it was like, oh, well, engine's small, armor's not that thick, gun's not that big. But in terms of its effectiveness in an operational setting, it really punched above its notional weight.
Yeah, and so a lot of those T-55s and T-62s are still left in place in Israel at the moment, just as a reminder to the Syrians, this is what happened last time you came through, type thing. So they lost about 300 of their 500-plus tanks. And when we say 500-plus, just because there's 500 MBTs running around doesn't mean that there's also another probably 200 or 300 APCs and thousands of artillery pieces, all involved with this attack. And the surface-to-air missiles they were using were very effective at this stage, which is why the Israelis didn't have a lot of air cover. So their Skyhawks were getting taken down by the Russian surface-to-air missiles that the Syrians were deploying. So that's why the tanks were pretty much by themselves.
Yeah, and now just skipping along a little bit, it's worth noting a Centurion did actually fight in the Falklands War.
Yes.
A beach army recovery vehicle, beach armored recovery vehicle.
Yes.
And the Israelis used them in the 1982 Lebanon War. Operation Desert Storm, the armored vehicle recovery version, was still in use by the British. And then the Syrian civil war, they've still been popping up. So, it's the fact that, as we keep saying, if a tank is reliable and competent, it can linger on in service for a very long time.
Yeah, if the chassis works, then you can just whack some petrol in it and make it go, and it's all workable. Then one was also deployed to Northern Ireland. This was again a more of an engineering tank than in order to bust open barricades in Northern Ireland. So by the Paras, Jordan used theirs in the Black September Civil War or PLA war. So when the PLA had been kicked out of Lebanon, they set up refugee camps in Jordan and then started carrying out activities against the Jordanian king, and he said, right, I've had enough of this, and he sent his Centurions in to take the fight to them and had to sort them out. South Africa. So while we don't think it's so much about South Africa and their wars, because there was not a lot of discussion about what they were doing for a long time, they had an ongoing war with Uganda. The Bush War went on for a long, long time. And after...
Uganda, or are you thinking of Namibia?
Sorry? Namibia?
Yeah.
No, it was in Namibia. The war was happening in Namibia, but it was with Uganda. So basically, the different forces between the two countries were, and there was and after 1962, while they'd had purchased the Centurions, after 1962, the apartheid started kicking in. The POMs would no longer provide them with parts or training or other resources. So they had to say, right, we've got these things. We can't supply them anymore. We're not going to use them. And then just put them on the back burner for quite a while. But as the Ugandan forces started getting more support from Cuba and having T-55 shipped in from Cuba, then suddenly the South Africans said, oh, hang on a sec, we're actually facing some armour here in Namibia, supported by Ugandan armed forces and the Cuban armed forces. So they just had to bring out their Centurions out of mothballs, fix them up, do them up, and find all the pieces, and basically introduce a locally built tank industry to support their elephants, as they're now calling them.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, because a bit like the way the British got stuck with their rifled ammunition for far too long, once you build up the industrial capacity to support the vehicle, then you need to keep using the vehicle that your industrial capacity matches up with.
Yep.
Which is kind of why the South Africans are still using it, because they had to develop an indigenous parts industry, and now that they've got that this is what we make parts for.
And nobody else is going to buy them, because unfortunately for them, nobody else is using them. So yes,
definitely an orphan at this point. Yeah, they look a lot like a leopard as well.
They do. The way they've redone the turret looks a lot like a leopard. But yes, the Oliphant is still out there and out, still going, even after the Bush War ended in 87, 88, I want to say. So they've basically said, all right, we've got this capability. We actually now need to maintain it and the Oliphants are still in use today. So there we go. But one thing we haven't covered today, John, is...
Is it time for the beer review?
It's time for the beer review.
Beer review.
Now,
okay,
John,
hang on a sec. Let me just get another one.
Now, John had asked thinking we're doing a classic British tank, we should be drinking a classic British beer, and suggested Boddington's as a classic British beer. But you know what you can't get in Canberra during the lockdown?
We've done all the Boddingtons.
During the middle of a lockdown, and I can justify it by saying I was looking for groceries. I could not find any Boddingtons anywhere nearby me. So what have we ended up with, John?
We are drinking Capital Brewing Co.'s Trail Pale Ale. Now, as regular listeners of this podcast will know, I worked for 4 years in the brewing industry, and I'm very good friends with a number of people who own Capital Brewing. On the other hand, my work experience and my ongoing professional relationship is with the other major brewery in Canberra, which is Benspoke Brewing. So in that level, Capital's kind of the rivals across the lake. But one of the owners of Capital did keep his bicycle in my shed for a number of years. So there's certainly some level of relationship there.
And we've gone for the Capital Brewing Trail Pale Ale because we wanted a beer that both John and I actually had, and I had one of these, and so he went out and bought some this morning in his Ugg boots.
The only time I've ever gone shopping with my Ugg boots is just lockdown depression, can't be stuffed putting shoes on. Yeah. People who go shopping in their Ugg boots, I'm like, is this really the level of mental damage that you've got constantly? Because, I am a mess right now. But, anyway, moving on.
I'm actually finding lockdown not too bad. I've got a lot of things, good things going for me at the moment, so I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, my first day of homeschooling with my child yesterday was a bit of a test, and so next week's going to be even more of a test. But anyway, so we are drinking the Trail Pale Ale because we both have one, and so that's what I.
And also, Centurion was an Australian-operated tank.
It was indeed. So, and however, this is an American pale ale bursting with pine and citrus flavors, a well-balanced malt profile, and smooth hop bitterness.
Wow, you've done everything I had to say just on reading off the can. So well done to the blurb writer on the can. I think I know who you are. Okay, I would say in terms of physical appearances, it's quite a pretty dark-ish pale ale.
Yes. Yes.
So it's sort of an orangey colour, which is
it's much. It's not as light as golden as most ones would be. It's
it's got a lovely white, soft, fluffy head. Extremely soft and fluffy, but nice and glossy on the top. So well done. I'll give that some good marks. And yeah, sort of citrusy, piney on the flavours. It's not a huge banger on the on the hops. It's strong, but it's not overwhelming. So I'd say that's well done. Good work. In fact, for session beer, if it gets bigger than that, it just starts to get.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that sort of statement. It's not too strong that you wouldn't want to have. You can't have more than two, so it goes down quite nicely.
I went to a folk festival. Must have been 2 years ago because of COVID. We haven't been to folk festival since, and it was pretty much the only decent beer they had available, and so I drank for a whole weekend nothing but trail pales at a significant rate. And it was pretty good. I enjoyed it.
Good. It's as an independent brewer, I'm quite happy to have them in Canberra. They're very supportive of the mountain biking community and the trail building communities, which is why it's called a trail pale, I'm assuming. They always provide them to folks who go out to work on their mountain biking trail days. They'll have a few trail pale ales out there.
I would also note, though, that Ben Spoke is actually the bicycle-themed brewery and also supports the mountain biking community significantly. So let's not let Capital own that.
Well, I was going to throw it in there that Christoph and Zierholz own the zebra community of Canberra. There you go.
Yes. I mean, what the big two are by just sales volume are Capital and Ben Spoke, and
yes.
And then Zierholz is probably definitely number 3, and then there's a bunch of other little small producers doing varying levels of distribution.
But Christoph and Zierholz was the first in Canberra. He's paved the way.
He wasn't actually the first brewery, though, because there'd been some other failed breweries before. But he's the first one that's still operating, I guess, the longest still operational brewery.
Yeah. There you go.
On you, Christoph.
Good work, Christoph.
He's not going to give me a free beer, though. He never gives me free beer.
We drank plenty of his beers, John, for free.
Yeah, well, he got a lot of free publicity for that. Anyway, all right. Capital Trail Pale. I would say Australian craft beer generally ships to the US better than a lot of American craft beer, simply because it has to be made to be shipped in 40-degree heat in this country. So it tends to travel better than a lot of craft beers. So if you see it, give it a go. It's a very solid drop, and I really like it.
Yeah. Capital Brewing, Trail Pale Ale. Yeah. No, it's very nice.
You know, we're going to have to do a Ben Spoke now, so we're going to have to figure out another Australian tank to talk about.
Sentinel. Sentinel's always there.
Sentinel's always there. Or the M1. So, you know.
What's that part on the front? It's not a penis.
Yeah. Definitely not. It just looks like one. That's the Sentinel, not the M1. Cool.
All right. So, look, other things about the Centurion.
So I just wanted to say I'm recording a tank podcast, and I'm literally having a friend who's in Western Australia has just texted me a picture of a tank asking me to identify it for him. So he's going to have to wait till we finish.
One thing I forgot to mention before is the reason why the Centurion didn't make it to D-Day and the invasion of the retaking of France was because at the time priority of tank building was given to existing British tanks. So while they could have pushed through, they probably had the design ready and they could have actually gotten it out there in 1944. They were giving priority to existing British tanks like the Cromwell and the Firefly. And so the Centurion didn't make it.
I've got to say, I mean, the Cromwell we will have to cover one day because it's a more interesting tank than it's given credit for. In terms of the doctrine of the British Army in 1944, Cromwell worked extremely well. In terms of can it beat a Tiger or a Panther in a fight? No, hell no. But
not head on, but if they swing around behind, yeah.
Yeah, but the whole point of, I mean, everything in the British Army at that point was about the artillery parks. An British infantry company in 1944 was just a bodyguard for the the infantry, the artillery liaison. So, in terms of a tank that was very fast, very maneuverable, had a good radio in it, could get to the top of a hill and see what was going on, and then call down the wrath of the artillery on anything going around, Cromwell was actually quite functional. But in terms of can I win tank battle, it just wasn't any good at that, whereas Centurion would have been awesome, but they didn't need it because they had huge artillery parks.
And they were better off getting more Cromwells onto the battlefield than 6 Centurions.
Yeah. It was basically the fact that Comet and Cromwell were finally a competent cruiser tank compared to the garbage that the British have been fighting the rest of the war with.
Yes. All right. Any other final points we want to talk about the Centurion, John, before we move on to more modern-day events?
I think we just about covered it, except that, it is just such a... to me, it will always be the archetypal tank. If you ask me to draw a picture of a tank, what I draw is going to look like a Centurion. So turning our attentions to the Afghanistan debacle, I just wanted to say, it was lovely from a tank lover's point of view, seeing the Taliban riding their T-55s into Kabul and the pictures of that. It wasn't lovely because, fundamentally I wouldn't wish the Taliban on the population of Kabul. That's kind of terrible. But it's also worth noting we've had a really, really, really terrible Western propped up government there that literally ran for the airport with its Louis Vuitton bag stuffed full of currency and jewellery at the first sign of trouble, and the Afghan people are probably in the long run better off without those criminals that we inflicted on them.
Yes.
And also that the horrible war crimes that Western special forces in particular and, right up there, Australian special forces, but by no means alone, have been committing there certainly did not help win any hearts or minds or convince anyone that we were actually the good guys in any way. But the debacle of the evacuation, and I mean, even today there's footage of British soldiers securing bits of Kabul airport and huge crowds of people waving British passports saying, when can we get on our plane? And they've been told by the British Embassy to go to the airport, but they haven't got a reference number. They haven't got any way of identifying themselves that they're supposed to be there. And this has been a withdrawal that's been at least 9 months in the planning and probably a little more, and no one thought, what are we going to do to make sure all of our citizens, let alone everyone who assisted us, could leave? It's diabolically bad to watch, and it's it'd be even worse to be there.
Yeah, no, I would not wish that on anybody. It's a bad situation all around. And look, who knows what the future will bring. At the moment, as John said before, we're sitting here at home because we're in lockdown. So the world is changing ever more at the moment, from whether it's from COVID or it's these activities that's happening in the pulling out of Afghanistan, and what the influence the Chinese will suddenly have in there, and what the Taliban might have planned for the future. Whether or not the Iranians want to have any sort of influence on the area. It's all brand new world. And I just hope the people of Afghanistan, all I can say is I'm sorry, and that I hope things don't get worse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of reminded of American Marine General Smedley Butler's comments that the best thing we can do to help. He was talking about the Latin America is just not get involved in their wars.
Yep.
Let them sort it out amongst themselves. Now, obviously, when you get attacks like September the 11th, that kind of did, I will acknowledge, create a pressure to not just let Afghanistan get on with what it was doing, but let's also be clear that almost everyone involved in that attack was a Saudi, not an Afghani.
Yep.
And we did nothing about Saudi Arabia.
No, they're still our close allies.
Yeah.
And that's where the money's coming from all these all these areas.
Yeah.
The money is coming from there.
So I just, we have put out a request, and we've been told will get in touch with us, who's a Canadian Leopard tank commander, but he's off driving his recreational vehicle around Canada this summer, and will get back to us when he returns. So if you're listening, we are awaiting your email and looking forward to talking to you about that. So that'll be interesting, but certainly, there's a lot of ex-Soviet armour on the move in Afghanistan, and frankly, it's amazing that anyone could keep a T-55 without getting blown up by the Americans for 20 years, and then roll it out in working order to roll into Kabul. That's an achievement in itself.
Now we're assuming that there are no Leopards or M1s left in country for the Taliban to take. But
I would assume they got the heavy armour out. I mean, there have been an enormous number of American vehicles captured in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, but that will be mainly your
Humvees and stuff.
Which nobody cares about because they're. But as long as the comms equipment is taken out of them,
That's no guarantee that happened. I mean, there's been all sorts of weird stuff going on. I mean, Camp Leatherneck, I think they destroyed 2,000 laptops as they ran away. There was it Bagram Air Base, where the Americans left in the night, and the local Afghans were surprised to find themselves alone when they woke up in the morning with the power and water turned off. On one level, I really resent Joe Biden saying the Afghans didn't want to fight when it's, some Afghans chose not to fight for this horrible thing that you created. And also a lot of Afghans have fought and died. A lot more Afghans have fought and died in defense of this than Americans. So who are you to be blaming them for this horrible situation? There's the management of the moment, which is appalling, but then there is the whole Joe Biden has completely done the right thing by saying we are getting out and we are not coming back, and we shouldn't have been there for the last 20 years. Certainly, the proof is in the pudding. Nothing was achieved.
I agree. Yep. I mean, the last person to have had any success over there was Alexander, and that was 2,500 years ago.
Oh, come on! I mean, the British got massacred once, but they did rule it for 80 years after that as well. I don't totally subscribe to the view that Afghanistan is indomitable, but I would certainly agree that Afghanistan is really tough. And I mean, I do love the saying of the Taliban that they've got the watches, but we've got the time.
I do like that. It is, and look, with half the population under 25, most of the people all they've known is the occupation of their country. That's a huge situation. So,
and then they just don't want to live under an occupation. I wouldn't want to live under an occupation. Most of our listeners wouldn't be happy if they were being occupied by another country. And hopefully, Afghanistan can find some way through that works for most of them. It's but particularly a revolution, all sorts of bad stuff happens. Doesn't matter how noble the revolutionaries are, and I'm not saying the Taliban are particularly noble. I would say the Taliban are quite religious, though. I
can make a lot of predictions of what they're going to be like, and make a lot of guesses, but I don't know. I just don't know. It might turn. They may be better than they were 25 years ago. They may be worse. I don't know.
Yeah, but you will definitely get atrocities being committed in the regions by local young men being given more freedom and power than they've ever dreamed of. And I do not know of any nationality of young men who I would want to be around if they were given a lot of power. that's just a recipe for disaster.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway.
And on that note, we've been going on quite a while. This is our first time not recording in the same room, so I hope, listeners, you can be patient with our
rambling
and struggles with the technology and the rest. I'll try and edit it up. Other than that, happy 21st episode for Totally Tanked. Thanks so much to the enormous number of people who've piled in as listeners recently. We're going to clock our 10,000th download in the next couple of weeks. So that's kind of awesome. And obviously, hopefully there's many more of you out there, so tell your friends and give us a good review on whatever service you're using to listen to. Yeah.